Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 5th of December of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the United States of America because a very important document was published today. The United States has unveiled a new national security strategy. Key points: ending the conflict in Ukraine is a vital US interest. The conflict in Ukraine has driven the European Union into external dependence on China, while European officials are trampling on democratic norms. The United States will make significant diplomatic efforts to restore stability in relations between Europe and Russia. Europe must take responsibility for its own defense. The United States will help the European Union rebuild Ukraine to preserve it as a state. The United States will not allow Iran to dominate the Middle East. At the same time, the Middle East is no longer viewed as dominant factor in American foreign policy. The Indo-Pacific region will be one of the key geopolitical and economic fronts in this century. The United States should focus on trade with China only in non-strategic goods. So this is a very interesting security strategy that was published by the United States of America. The experts are saying that this document is not something that must be applied immediately and that US authorities should follow this document. Nothing like this. According to information we have, it's just, let's say, a diplomatic message to the world, to different countries, and especially this is a diplomatic message to the Russian Federation that Russia is no longer a threat to the United States of America. Furthermore, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio during the previous 24 hours stated that the deal on Ukraine might be signed within a few weeks. Vice President of the United States of America once indicated, "I really believe we have made significant progress, but we have not yet reached the finish line. There is hope, and I hope there will be good news on this front in the next few weeks." Furthermore, I would like to remind you that today the Ukrainian delegation fled to the United States of America. We're talking about the head of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Umerov, and Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Gnatov. They flew to the United States for a meeting on the peace plan, according to Zelensky. So something is happening right now. But at the same time, and despite all these efforts that the United States of America are doing, some countries in Europe still believe that the special military operation must continue. For example, today we got a report that the United Kingdom government is ready to transfer frozen Russian assets to Ukraine worth 10.6 billion. The newspaper The Times reported this, citing a source in the government. Plans to use frozen Russian assets in the United Kingdom to finance Ukraine were discussed during a meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Brussels on December 3, the newspaper reports. At the same time, some European countries began thinking and believing that begin acknowledging that Ukraine will have to lose territory to end the conflict. This information was stated by the El País. Representatives of several governments hinted to the Kiev ambassador that certain concessions may be inevitable. A sense of importance is growing in Europe regarding the role it can play in the peace process in Ukraine. The idea that territorial concessions are inevitable is quietly spreading across Europe as a lesser evil. Some European officials, without saying so directly, hinted that peace is impossible without a significant portion of the concessions demanded by Russia. Nevertheless, the idea that Ukraine might agree to territorial losses is causing serious resistance in the Baltic states and Poland. So, you know that the question is, as I understand from the European countries, is not whether it's worth it or not to give some territories to the Russian Federation. The question is whether the Russians will stop with this. But if I understand the Russians correctly, they don't see Ukraine as a part of European Union or as a part of NATO. Russia always see Ukraine as a part of Russian sphere of influence. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. Let's talk about Ukraine. Today we have lots of very interesting updates. And first, let's talk about the Zaporozhye direction. We haven't been talking about this area for a very long period of time. As of the 5th of December of 2025, we have just one video published from this area, but the video is a very important one. Here we can see how a Russian drone was hunting Ukrainian vehicles, and when another vehicle was discovered, the vehicle vehicle was immediately destroyed. And it's not just a regular vehicle, this is a HIMARS system. So as you can see, the Ukrainians for some reason left a HIMARS system right, let's say, along the river of Dnipro, and it wasn't a very big deal and problem for the Russians to discover this HIMARS system. And when the system was discovered, it was immediately destroyed. So Ukrainians lost millions of dollars basically for nothing. Now let's talk about the Zaporozhye direction. During the previous 12 hours, the most important updates came to us from the area of the city of Gulay-Polye, where Russians continued their offensive operation. As we discussed during the previous video, now the Russians are tasked to capture the city of Gulay-Polye as fast as possible. So this is the main task of the armed force of the Russian Federation. They must take the city before 2026 comes. And in this video, for example, we can see how Russians were bombing the central part of the city of Gulay-Polye with a significant number of aviation bombs. Basically, the Russians are not tasked to save the city. Maybe the Russians were tasked to save the city of Mirnograd or Pokrovsk, but as for the city of Gulay-Polye, they are tasked to reduce the city to ruins as soon as possible and as fast as possible, because they need to move further in the western direction until the Ukrainians are not able to collect additional forces with the purpose to stabilize the situation. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours, we received lots of videos from the fields to the east of the settlements of Varvarovka and Priluki. So 3 geolocations came to us, were published during the previous 24 hours, and all of them are about how Ukrainians were bombing and attacking Russians in this area. This is the moment when Russians were bombed by Ukrainian artillery forces. This is the video when Ukrainians were attacking Russians with FPV drones, and this is the video when Ukrainians were attacking Russians with artillery as well. So lots of episodes took place exactly in this video, in this area, and based on these videos we have adjusted the map. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 4th of December, and this is the situation by the end of the 5th of December. The Russians improved their position significantly, and Russians, as we can see, continue their offensive operation further in the southern direction with the purpose to capture the settlement of Varvarovka. And we believe that in 2 or 3 days the village of Varvarovka would be captured by the armed forces of the Russian Federation, and then the Russians will continue offensive operation further in the southern direction to attack the city of Gulay-Polye from behind. So the Ukrainians understand the crisis, how critical the situation is. So that is why the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours, maybe even during the previous 48 hours, carry out several counterattacks in the area of the R85 road, and as a result of those counterattacks, the Ukrainians managed to cross the river of Gaichul and to capture the central part of the settlement of Dobropolye. When Ukrainians captured the central part of the village, they raised the Ukrainian flag. So as a proof, as an evidence that the settlement, or at least this part of the settlement, is under complete control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. So we need to understand the logic of Ukrainians. They are not tasked, let's say, to recapture the entire Zaporozhye direction until the city of Ugledar. No, the Ukrainians are not tasked with this. The Ukrainians are tasked just to attack Russians along R85 road and to deal damage and to cause losses to the Russians. Because now the Russians, and due to the fact that the Russians are tasked to capture the city of Gulay-Polye as soon as possible and as fast as possible, that is why the Russians decided to use every single soldier, every single vehicle, every single helicopter, every single aircraft for these purposes. Now the Russians concentrated everything. They have all their resources exactly in the Gulay-Polye direction. So that is why the Russians during the previous days were forced to take everything they can from every single direction they were advancing during the previous months. We are talking about, of course, just about the Zaporozhye direction, but Russians took everything from the settlement of Tikha, from the settlement of Pokrovska. The Russians took everything from the R85 road, and the Russians brought everything to the city of Gulay-Polye. So that is why now Russians have some problems along R85 road and along the line of combat contact. We believe that the offensive operation that took place in the area of Dobropolye carried out by Ukrainians wasn't the only offensive. We believe that Ukrainians will make more attempts to counterattack Russians just with one purpose: to slow them down and not to allow them to use all these reserves just in one place in the city of Gulay-Polye, because the city of Gulay-Polye is the most important city. If Ukrainians lose control over the territory, as we discussed in the previous videos, most likely in 5 or 6 months they will lose control even over the city of Zaporozhye. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. During the previous 24 hours, most of the changes came to us from the area to in the Dobropolye direction. The Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the area of the village by the name of Sofiivka and Toretska. So these are the changes on the map that were added according to different sources. So this information was published yesterday for the first time by different sources. So this is the map that was published by pro-Russian source, and today we adjusted the map and we came to conclusion that the Russians continue advancing in this area and that the Russians are about to capture both the villages of Toretska and Sofiivka. And after the fall of these villages, the Russians most likely will continue offensive operation further in the northern direction towards the settlement of Drushkovka, and with the purpose to encircle the city of Kostiantynivka from the north and to attack the Ukrainian contingent from behind. So now the city of Kostiantynivka is the most important city for both the Russians and for the Ukrainians, probably for the next 2 or 3 months. The city of Mirnograd is no longer important for Russians because the city encircled, the Russians are slowed down the pace of their offensive. They are not in a hurry. They don't want to, let's say, suffer losses during the street battles and battles for buildings. They try to bomb Ukrainians and just to force them to fall back, because Russians understand that sooner or later Ukrainians either would be forced to surrender or they will stay there forever. So that is why this direction is no longer important. The Russians are regrouping. The Russians are bringing additional equipment. The Russians are building engineering constructions, military fortifications, military infrastructure. They are bringing connections, equipment for connections, for lines, and so on. So they're creating a stronghold. They're creating a base. They're creating a foothold that the Russians will use in 2026 to finish the battle for the entire Donetsk region. But as of now, as we discussed, the most important is the city of Kostiantynivka. And it seems that according to information we have and according to reports we got during the previous week, the defense of the city of Kostiantynivka has collapsed completely. And we came to this conclusion based on the reports that we got from the area of the villages of Klinova, Bezymyanne, Popasne and Virolubovka. So as we can see, the territory to the north of the city of Kostiantynivka has collapsed completely. So what is happening here? I would like to remind you that just several days ago, more precisely on the 1st of December of 2025, the Russians reported that somehow they managed to capture the village of Klinova. So this is the situation by the end of November, and this is the situation by the beginning of December. Telling the truth, currently nobody knows how exactly the Russians managed to capture the village of Klinova. Maybe they captured the village exactly using these roads of attack. Nobody knows. We added these, let's say, let's hook this area just based on the report that was published by the Minister of Defense, but we have no idea how exactly Russians entered there. Probably just soldiers on the ground and the commander of the group of forces south know how exactly the Russians managed to do this. But as of the end of the 1st of December and as of the end of now, it's not important. The most important is updates. The most important are the updates that were published during the previous 24 hours. So first, this morning, pro-Russian sources stated that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Virolubovka. So this information was provided by different pro-Russian sources without proofs. We're talking about videos, geolocations, and so on. Based on the report published by pro-Russian source, we have added the gray zone. So this is the situation in this area. And later, probably a few hours after, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation stated that as a result of clashes, the units of the group of forces south managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Bezymyanne. So this is the village, and once again, by the end of the 5th of December of 2025, we haven't received anything that can give us some insights or additional details how exactly the Russians managed to do this. So basically, we colored the territory between the village of Bezymyanne and Klinova just based on the report that was published by Russians on the 1st of December that they captured the village of Klinova. So we came to the conclusion that if the village of Klinova was captured, then most likely Russians attacked the settlement of Bezymyanne from this area. Because the Russians didn't attack the settlement of Bezymyanne from Popasne or from Virolubovka, because both villages haven't been captured by Russians according to the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation or any other source. So we believe that this is the situation exactly in this area. And now it's become clear that the situation is disastrous for the Ukrainians in this area, because Russians are creating a very powerful foothold to the north of the city of Kostiantynivka. Ukrainians most likely likely in coming hours, maybe this upcoming night, would be forced to fall back from Vyrolyubovka. Most likely Ukrainians in coming hours would be forced to fall back from the territory of Popasna in the direction of the city of Kostiantynivka. Otherwise, they would be caught by the Russians in Koldrun. And from these positions, from this configuration of the front line, the distance between possible edge positions of the armed force of the Russian Federation, the city of Kostiantynivka itself is already less than 4 kilometers. We're talking about not the city, but we are talking about N20 road, the main logistic line that Ukrainians use to supply their contingent in the area of the city of Kostiantynivka itself. Furthermore, I would like to remind you that several days ago, during the meeting on the territory of some headquarters that was carried out between the president of the Russian Federation and commanders of different directions, the commander of the group of forces south stated, he promised, he's not stated, he didn't state, he promised that the group of forces south will capture probably the biggest part of the city of Kostiantynivka. Maybe he was talking about 60 or 70% of the city by the middle of December. So basically he has just 10 days to capture lots of territories, but telling the truth, and according to this configuration, we already see a picture that the city of Kostiantynivka is falling into another encirclement, into another cauldron, and it's just a matter of several days. So once again, if Russians somehow are able to improve their positions and to cross the railways and to attack Ukrainians, let's say on the Ukrainian side of railways, this is going to be the end for the contingent of the armed forces of Ukraine in Kostiantynivka. There's going to be just one road for evacuation through the fields in the northwestern direction, but this is exactly the area where the Russians are advancing in the vicinity of Sofiivka with the purpose probably to cut these fields also physically and not to allow the Ukrainians to escape this area. So the battle for Kostiantynivka, it seems, is going to be very fast, much faster than the battles for Pokrovsk, Mirnograd or Bakhmut or Toretsk. It's going to be a faster, much faster battle, and means if Russians are able to capture the city of Kostiantynivka very fast, this means that the Russians will be able to save lots of buildings and constructions. The Russians are not tasked to reduce the city of Kostiantynivka till ruins, because they don't need to do this, because the city is already encircled. The city of Gulyai-Polye would be reduced to ruins because the city isn't encircled. The Russians are not from behind. The Ukrainians have possibilities to receive supply and support, so that is why the Russians will reduce it as of their bulldozer or something like this. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of the city of Siversk. During the previous 24 hours, the most important update was published by the pro-Ukrainian sources. Here we can see that according to them, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the eastern part of the city. So this part of the settlement was captured according to pro-Ukrainian source. So this is the situation by the end of the 4th of December. This is the 5th of December. This is very important. And according also to this report, the Russians currently around, let's say, 5% of the city of Seversk, according to the pro-Ukrainian source, is under complete Russian control. Up to probably 60-65% are in the gray zone, and just probably 30% under control of the armed forces of Ukraine. And mainly we're talking about the territories that are located to the west of the river of Bakhmutka. So according to pro-Ukrainian sources, this is the only territory that is under control of the armed forces of Ukraine. The rest is either in the gray zone or under control of the Russian units. So this is the situation. Furthermore, today we got another report, a very interesting report from pro-Ukrainian source. He described the situation in the area of the city of Siversk as a very difficult situation, which means that it seems that the city of Siversk will fall very soon, especially due to a crisis, due to another crisis in the area of Svято-Pokrovska. I would like to remind you that just during the previous days, the Russians captured up to 50% of the settlement, and they continue advancing, which means that Ukrainians have less and less lines, roads for supply and for support of their contingent there. As for the Liman direction, during the previous 24 hours, the most important updates came from the settlement of Drobyshevo. Ukrainian sources published a video of how they were counterattacking Russians in the most southwestern part. Here we can see Ukrainian special forces that were clearing the southeastern part of the settlement of Yarovo, trying to force the Russians to fall back from this area. And as a result of clashes, the Ukrainians most likely secured this territory. And we believe that due to the fact that Ukrainians managed to recapture these territories, we believe that the lands further in the northeastern directions under control of Russians. Furthermore, according to neutral mappers, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to capture this dense network of the fortifications, so the Drobushevo stronghold. This is the map by the end of the 4th, and this is the end of the 5th of December. So now from these updates and from these videos, we can make a conclusion that the settlement of Drobushna was caught by the Russians in pincers from the west and from the east, and now the Russians are planning to advance further with the purpose to take the village under complete control. As for the Kupiansk direction, as we discussed in the previous video, the Ukrainians most likely managed to carry out successful counterattacks in the western part of the city, forcing the Russians to fall back from this area. We came to this conclusion based on the several reports that were published by pro-Ukrainian neutral mappers. So based on these things, we have adjusted the map. At the same time, very heavy clashes continue in the Kharkiv region. During the previous 24 hours or during the previous days, Ukrainians tried to counterattack Russians in the area of their offensive operation using at least 3 tanks, but every single tank was destroyed as a result of Russian FPV drone attack. Or maybe it's the same tank, but that was attacked from different positions in different areas. Anyway, Ukrainians were trying to counterattack, but they suffered losses and were forced to fall back. As for the Volchansk direction, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions in the area of the settlement of Liman. The video was published by pro-Ukrainian sources, and here we can see how Ukrainians were attacking positions of the armed force of the Russian Federation through the settlement of Liman in its western part. Based on this video, we came to the conclusion that the Russians continue advancing both in the area of the city of Liman, the village of Liman, and in the area of the Sinelnikovo forest, trying to get as deep as possible, trying to get as close as possible to the settlement of Velika Verkhnya Pisarevka. This is a very important settlement because there is a dam in this area, and most likely there are lots of possibilities for Ukrainians to transfer their units from one side of the river of Seversky Donetsk to another. So that is why the Russians are trying to block this area and not allow the Ukrainians to bring additional reinforcements from here. The Russians are trying to force Ukrainians to use additional roads further to the south, which most likely will cause damage to the Ukrainian logistic. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.